CIT 1121, Module 10, Basic Router Configuration. In this section, we're going to cover basic router configs, starting with the initial configuration, then interface configuration, and then talk about default gateways again. So if you haven't had enough of default gateways, don't worry, we've got more for you. Just essentially the table of contents of what I just mentioned. And let's get into the first part, which is initial router settings. And in initial router settings, what they're looking for is some basic settings that you're going to set on a router. It's just kind of security stuff. And pretty much a couple things we should look at here. Notice this. At some point in time, you had gone from user mode into privilege mode, and we're starting you in global configuration mode on these slides. So we've already made our way into global config mode. And whenever you're doing configuration mode, when you get into global config, that's when you can change the processes that are happening on the router. And also keep in mind, and it gets down to the bottom of this slide, is the changes that you make in the interface happen immediately. The router is active in what's called the running config. Now, here's the thing. If you wanted to save these configurations, you save them to the startup configuration. So if the router was turned off and then it gets turned back on again, then the changes that you had made would be saved. If you don't add that bottom line first, that copy running config startup config line, which is copy source to destination. So copy and then running config, and then which is the source, which is what we're working off of right now, into the startup config. If the router goes off and turns back on again, everything we did above this will be saved, but if we don't add that copy running config startup config line, it won't be saved. So if the power happens to go out, or you reset the router and you haven't saved your configuration, there's no safety copy. There's no like, hey, I noticed that you made a whole bunch of changes. Would you like to go back to what you did before? None of that exists in the Cisco router. So it's a little harsh in terms of saving things. But on the good side is if you type in a command and it's totally wrong and it takes down the entire router, no big deal. Just turn it back, turn it off, turn it back on again. At least it'll be back to where it was before you entered that command in. So that's kind of a cool thing. A couple other things about this particular slide. Starting up here at the top, basic things they want you to look at: host name, and it's the the base command host name, and then host name is whatever you want to change the name of the router to. So the host name value is going to appear in this column right here. So by default, a router is going to be called router. And if you want to change the host name to something else, then when you put in the host name command, you type in R1, then the component here would not be router anymore. It would be R1. Okay? So keep that in mind. The enable secret password. I think we went through this before also, but it's been a couple of weeks. The enable secret password is the password that you're going to use to get from user mode into privilege mode, right? To change that prompt from a greater than sign into a hashtag or a pound sign. That password can be guarded with two different passwords. There's an enable password command and there's an enable secret command. The enable password command is inactivated if the enable secret command is used. We'll talk about the difference in just a second, but just be aware of this. Enable password was something that was set first. Enable secret was something that came along later as a fix to the problem with enable password. So what's the problem with the command enable password and then putting your password in? And the problem is this, is when you do a show running config of the configuration that you've built, the password is in clear text when you do enable password and put in a password. So if someone wanted to steal your password, all they would have to do is gain access to your session and type in show run, and they could see your password to get into privileged mode. So they pretty early on decided that that's fairly insecure. So we'll instead of removing enable password or updating its usage, what they did is they made a new command called enable secret. And the enable secret command is the command you would use to guard the privilege level. But when you do a show run, the password is hashed out, so you can't see exactly what the password is. There's a 30-character value in its place, so you wouldn't be able to shoulder surf someone or just type in show run and get somebody's password. It would be a little more difficult than that. So, all of that being said, The enable secret is what you're going to use when you want to guard the privileged level. The enable password command is something that you're just not going to use. You're just not going to use that. Okay, now, moving down a little bit further. When we get here to line console, line console is the password it is the interface that allows you to log in locally, not through TCP/IP, but through that thin it's called a rollover cable. Through that thin rollover cable, that medical blue cable that we see all the time, from the console port of the device into a serial interface on your computer using something like TerraTerm or PuTTY or HyperTerm from long ago. But the console means you have direct access to the device. You have a computer, you've got a cable coming out of it that goes into a serial interface, you're using some type of RS-232 hyperterminal emulation software, and you're accessing the device directly. So we call that a console link. Everyone should be familiar with that. And to set that link up, you might want to protect that with a password. So line console 0 just says this. The console interface on the back of the router is what we're protecting. This is a line. A line is something you would use to connect into the device to configure it, whereas an interface is something that's being used on the router to forward traffic and to just pass along the intermediate. When it's used as an intermediary device. Its job is to take something from one interface to another. A line, on the other hand, is a pathway into configuring the device. The two lines that you need to be worried about are the console and the VTY lines. We'll get to those in a second. But the console is the actual port on the back of the device, and you have to directly connect to it. So physical access, and if you want to configure that with a password, it's line console 0, and then the keyword password, and then whatever you want your password to be. Now, here's the deal. You can set up a console password, but it won't ask for the password unless you use the keyword login at the end. So login needs to be added as well. This is just one of those things where the way the programming works is this. Line console 0 by default is something you can log in on. There is no password. You can log into it. You can set a password on it. That's great. And then if you removed yourself and then tried to log in again, you'd still be able to log in, even if there was a password, because it never asked for it. So what the command login does is it says prompt login should be called prompt for password. That's the name of the command. That's what it should be. But it's login. So in the last 15 years, you haven't been able to do a password command and have it stay without a login command. It'll give you an error if you don't put a login after it. But that's why you need those two lines. So set the password and then enable the prompt for the password, which is login. And that's the two things you need to add for a console login. Great. Now, right below that, we've got line VTY, and then we've got 0 space 4. So we're right in here. And when we get into these line commands, line VTY stands for virtual terminal emulation. Virtual terminal emulation. And the lines are numbered, and they're numbered based on activity. So in this case, it says line VTY 0 space 4. Now that is 0 space 4 is a range. So it means 0 through 4, but we don't use dashes for range in Cisco for whatever reason. We just do number space number. That's supposed to equal a range. You'll get used to it, and it is. So basically what it says is this. If I wanted to telnet or SSH into the device, and more on those later, but if I wanted to gain access to the management of the device through TCP/IP, through my computer and through a telnet session or an SSH session, I would have remote access into managing the device. Great. So this is a cool thing. I don't have to be right next to the router to configure it, whereas with the console port, I do. But with a VTY line, I don't. I can get in through TCP/IP. I can get in through any of the actual interfaces on the device. So they are virtual terminals into the IP interfaces on the device. Once again, 0 through 4 just means range. The first device in gets line 0. The second device in or out, or I should say in or out, gets line 1. The next device gets line 2, so on and so forth. So in this case, you'd have 5 lines. All of the lines, no matter if you're the first device in or the 5th device in or somewhere in between, your password is going to be whatever you set the password up to be right here. So you'd have those 5 lines configured exactly the same way. If a sixth device tried to log in, there wouldn't be a line for it, so it would be rejected. Understood? Hopefully. So that's where the password comes in there. Login works just like we talked about login for console, same thing. And then they got another command here that you may or may not need. In most cases, you will eventually. Transport input. Transport input says, what default protocol are we going to utilize for pulling in information? What port should we be looking at? And the answer is most of the cases going to end up being SSH. Telnet is the original communications protocol for remotely accessing the management of intermediary devices in all telecommunications. However, the password is sent in clear text on Telnet, which is insecure, so it kind of got replaced with SSH, where you kind of run Telnet through a secure channel. So SSH is most likely what you're going to add in here. That's just the difference between those two. They both do the same thing, though. Remote access to management console. And then right below that, we have the command service password encryption. Service password encryption is set to do exactly what enable secret did for the password. Service password encryption will do for the line and the console passwords when you do a show run. So when you do a show run, that will encrypt or at least hash out the VTY and the console passwords for both of those. Okay? So hopefully that's a pretty good start for where we're at here. Down below that, we do also have a banner situation. And you'll see these in the labs as well. And I'll have videos of how to punch in the labs. So banner MOTD. Banner MOTD just stands for Message of the Day banner. Banner is just something that's going to appear on your readout or your connection that maybe says something like authorized connections only, or this router is property of XYZ organization. Unauthorized use will be punishable by XYZ, so on and so forth. And so banner MOTD, and then it just show you here, there are a couple of pound signs and then a message in between. The pound signs in this case are just what are called delimiting characters. Delimiting character is just this. It says this. I'm going to put in this particular character right after MOTD. That's what the program is looking for. And it says this, when the next time I see this, I know that that is the end of the message. So you put in a delimiting character. It doesn't have to be a pound sign. And if you have a pound sign in your message, then that's definitely not what you want to use. But it has to be a character that is not in your message that delineates the beginning and the end of the message. When you do the lab on it, to make it a little bit easier. All right, enough on that slide. Let's move on to the next one. This slide gets into now punching out all of those commands one by one and just showing them to you here. So same thing that we just saw. So hostname, change hostname R1 changes it to now R1, although I guess it was R1 before that. It should be router there, but who cares? Enable secret class. So we enabled the secret password is now class. So when we type in enable and we want to go from user to privileged, class is what we're going to type in. Line console 0, the password for that is Cisco. Keyword login after that. Line VTY 0 / 4. First 5 virtual terminal lines. Password will be Cisco. Login has been enabled. And the transport input is SSH Telnet, which means it'll accept both SSH and Telnet. Exit goes through. Service password encryption is now set, so all the passwords are going to be hidden within the show running config. When you do the running config report, you will not see the actual passwords. And then they put in the banner here. So banner MOTD, delimiting character of #. Enter text message, end with a new line, and then the #, and then they put in warning, unauthorized access is prohibited, and done an exit there, and then saved everything, copy, run, start. So if this router was rebooted, everything that was done here would stay there. In a later lesson, we'll show you how to copy down everything that's in your configs, just in case they accidentally get deleted, which does happen every once in a while. So keep an eye on that.